Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Welcome, everybody. I am very excited today to be joined by Riva Greenberg. I have known Riva for a few years now and have had the honor of working with her and her husband on putting together a book on complexity and sense-making inspired by the Cynefin framework. Riva is an internationally recognized diabetes educator who provides education and advocacy on living with diabetes. In 2015, she was awarded a Distinguished Lecture Award from the International Diabetes Foundation, and she continues to speak at the Federation's annual conference on her flourishing approach to diabetes. She has written 3 books and has also contributed to the HuffPost on the topic. She is committed to helping others live an exceptional life, not despite having diabetes, but because of it. As of 2022, she has lived with diabetes type 1 for 50 years and has just received her Jocelyn Award. She continues to act as an influencer and ambassador for type 1 and advises industry, healthcare professionals, and patients. Today, Riva and I are going to be discussing the issues with industrialized healthcare's culture of control and how we can move from a more pathogenic culture of seeking to control chronic diseases to one that recognizes the variability of patient lives and encourages salutogenesis, or the sense of coherence that patients can seek by cultivating their ability to understand their own condition, manage and respond appropriately, and to also create meaning around their experience. Welcome, Riva, to the Salience Podcast.
Thank you, Shin. It's terrific to be here.
So, Riva, I would really love for you to tell everyone, because I've known you, I've known your husband, Bao, for a bit of time, so I know your remarkable story, but I think it'd be great for the audience to learn a bit more about you, your background, and how you became who you are today. What are some key cultural influences and life events in your life?
So, as far as diabetes, I got type 1 diabetes when I was 18 years old. And it was rather odd because, for most people, you have it for quite a while before you know you have it. That includes type 1 and type 2. And it was just happenstance. I was in my first year of university, and it was just happenstance that they closed the dormitories for athletic games in the winter and sent us all home unexpectedly. So that when I got home to my parents' house, I woke up with what I'd been waking up with for months, which were these horrendous leg cramps. And I was actually screaming in pain. And my mother said, "We're taking you to the doctor." And that's where I was diagnosed. They did a blood test. My blood sugar level was off the charts and put me in the hospital for 4 days. And this was, as you said, 51 years ago. So at that time, if you're diagnosed with type 1, you're put in the hospital for several days. That doesn't tend to happen today. And, you learn how to inject an orange with insulin. Lovely. And then I was released back into the wild. I went back to my university, experienced what they call the honeymoon phase, which is often the first year. It's as if the symptoms just go away. And when they came back, since I was 19 years old, they thought I had type 2 diabetes because at the time it was thought you only had type 1 if you were a little kid. 5, 6, 7. In fact, type 1 was called juvenile diabetes in those days. They had to change the name when they realized that you could get it at any age. I have friends who've gotten it at 59 and 65. So anyway, I was on oral medication rather than insulin injection, so my blood sugar was obviously high all the time. And it took 10 years before we had glucometers so that you could check your blood sugar at home. Anyway, my career in the early days was as an advertising copywriter. And then I left the industry to do inspirational greeting cards. And after 4 years of living as a starving artist, I got a job in Tokyo, Japan, as an advertising writer, which was sort of an amazing experience. I lived there for 6 years. I traveled around the world, and it's actually where I met the guy that I would end up marrying. So it was rather pivotal. Anyway, during that time, when I got out of college, I was diagnosed as type 1. They put me on insulin. I began to better manage it. And it was when I was 48 years old that 3 things happened that actually launched this second career. I lost my job through no fault of my own. My company went bankrupt. That's the year I was getting married. And so that's the year I went to a diabetes educator for the first time after having diabetes for 32 years. I wanted to be as healthy as I could for both of us. So I began to think, what would I like to do since I had to look for work again? And I thought maybe I could help other people with diabetes. And at 48, I wasn't going to go back to medical school, and that wasn't my interest anyway. But I was a professional writer, so I began by interviewing people who had diabetes and capturing their story. And then I began going to conferences and meeting people in the field. I began writing online, both my own blog and for different journals. Then I was asked to speak at conferences. So that's really how it all happened. And it was kind of when social media was first getting going. So in many ways, I was just in the right place at the right time. People often ask me, how do I do what you're doing? And as you would know from complexity theory, I can't give them a roadmap and I can't give them 5 simple steps because everything's based on context, what's happening at the time, what your resources and connections are. But that's basically how I got to do what I'm doing.
That's an incredible story. I mean, you've clearly had a mountain of experiences. I think you've squeezed it into that little snippet, and I want to get into all of the different parts of that story. But I first want to sort of talk about this flourishing approach to diabetes that you've developed, and also, how you managed through your own experiences. Because as you've mentioned, when you were first diagnosed, they didn't know as much. They weren't the type of medical equipment and, instruments that can help you to manage the condition that we have today, right? So, if you could share a little bit both about this approach that you have developed, what underpins it, and also, how in your own experiences working through some of your early challenges that help you to come to those kinds of understanding that you now teach other people about today.
Well, I think the fact that I married Baldwin, whom you know well, was one of the primary influences for creating this approach. He's a student of complexity, and he always brings different viewpoints to me, which has so expanded how I see things. But largely in healthcare, the way we treat chronic illness, which more and more people are living with chronic illness and living with more and more chronic illnesses, but the way we treat people with chronic illness is very much what we would call the way they treat acute illness, right? Let's find out what the problem is and let's fix it. And so people who have diabetes and other chronic illnesses largely are exposed to that kind of mentality. So if you have diabetes, particularly type 1, you're going to go to your endocrinologist and they're going to look at all your numbers. And then they're going to try to fix them to make them in range and all of that. And they forget that there's a person sitting in front of them. They forget that there's an actual human being sitting in front of them who has a life and is more than their numbers. So, and this idea of the medical person being the authority rather than it being a partnership. So, I think this is changing, but still very often it'll be the doctor tells you what to do this, do that, eat better, go exercise, with no real understanding of who you are, what your life is like. And then you're supposed to leave their office and just do what they say. Well, it doesn't work particularly well, right? Because there's so much they don't know. And so Badwine and I really looked at this and looked at, rather than use this type of approach with people who have diabetes, and we look particularly at diabetes because that's my field, but really this applies for almost all chronic illnesses. Let's take a salutogenesis approach, right, rather than a pathological approach. Let's look at how do we create health? And, it's a matter of understanding what the situation is and how to work with it and knowing what's meaningful to you. So we bring those aspects to what we call the flourishing approach. And we very much take a solution-focused approach. So when you're with someone who has a condition, you ask them what they're doing well, rather than concentrate on what's not going as well. And then you converse together to learn, well, how do they do that? And how might they do a little bit more of it? So it's a very collaborative approach, and it's a very open approach where actions emerge, largely suggested by the patient. And in the end, you usually have something that the patient wants to do, in fact, is excited to do when they leave your office. In fact, we saw this in motion. So I think it was in 2014 or 2015, I was invited to do some pro bono work with a diabetes clinic in Bangalore, India. And we both went, and I was teaching the staff aspects of how to work with their patients from the flourishing approach. And I had just given a class when the next morning the dietitian ran over to me, giggling. And she was, Riva, you won't believe it. I did what you told us yesterday. And my patient got so excited because he came up with what he wants to do. And we both started giggling. And he left smiling, and now he's got his next step in his care. So, you create that kind of energy. And so those are sort of the underpinnings, right? Like one of the principles of the flourishing approach, shall we say, is something I coined rapport before report. Right. So rather than going into your doctor and all they're doing, as I said, is looking at the numbers and that's your report, you're actually creating rapport. You're seeing who the person is in front of you. You're finding out more, their resources, what's meaningful to them, what they're capable of doing. And you use those kinds of guidances rather than, this is a little controversial to say, but every year they come out in diabetes, particularly with what we call the standards of care, which is your cholesterol should be here, your blood sugar should be there. And I think, unfortunately, our medical professionals spend a lot more attention on the standards of care rather than the care of the person in front of them. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That because I've had the benefit and deep privilege of learning from you and from Baldwin, it's just such been such a profound discovery for me, this difference between the approaches. As you've mentioned, the traditional industrialized healthcare approach, they conform to these standards as though they were universal, and as though there is one thing that can apply to everybody, regardless of the fact that oftentimes a lot of these chronic conditions tend to have comorbidities, right? They are also interacting with other chronic conditions, other medications. They are interacting with the variability of lifestyles, of levels of activity on a day-to-day basis. And also, somebody who is a single mother working 3 jobs, for example, has very limited choices as compared to somebody who's upper middle class and has those choices. And I love, this development of this flourishing approach where it is, as you've mentioned, let's partner, let's seek to understand your condition as it is unique to you, and then develop something that works for you. I found that so profound.
And isn't it funny, because when you really think about it, isn't it common sense?
Yes.
I mean, that's really what I've found in a lot of stuff like this. It's just common sense. It's just common sense to see that there's a human being in front of you with a life. It's just common sense to understand that, like, we're very fond, at least here, and you let me know if this would be true where you are as well, that you can control diabetes, that you can control your blood sugar. I mean, control is the word used everywhere. Would you say it's true where you are as well, Sean?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what a crazy notion. I mean, I've had diabetes now for 51 years. It'll be 51 years, February 22nd. And I cannot control this at all. It is not as though my cumulative learning means that I can control it today. My blood sugar will still go high and low because there's so much complexity within the body. What's going on? There's the unpredictability of life. When I think I'm planning to take a walk, and so I take my insulin and eat accordingly, and then a thunderstorm happens, and all of a sudden I'm not taking that walk, and that has consequences for blood sugar. So it's craziness. Did I get sleep? Am I stressed? Am I getting sick? It is truly beyond my control. So what we talk about in the flourishing approach is you can influence your blood sugar. You can learn your patterns. You can learn how different foods typically affect your blood sugar. You can learn not to freak out when you check your blood sugar, see what the number is, and if it's out of range, you can learn how to, we like to say, nudge and navigate it back into range. You can learn those things, and you can do those things very successfully, but you will never be successful at controlling your blood sugar.
So there's sort of 2 sides to this next question. There is the experience from the patient, whom, as you've mentioned, are they recognize that, as you've mentioned, there is a common sense element to this. They recognize that my life is not going to be planned to a T. I won't always be able to go on that walk when I plan it. Or, I think my food is going to arrive in the next 20 minutes, but something might happen. They might forget my order. There is this common sense understanding to it. And yet, there is this sense of guilt, right? When you don't keep within the bounds that you're supposed to. So on the side of the patient, right, what are some pieces of advice that you could give them? And then on the flip side, so this is maybe a 2-part question, is because you work with patients and you also work with healthcare professionals who are having to administer the care and to do the education with the patient as well. Where do you see receptivity to these ideas, and how do you recommend that they balance the need to have some kind of packaged routine care, and also acknowledge the complexities of living on this earth?
Oh my goodness, that's about 15 questions in one. You'll have to remind me. Well, I would say for people who are living with diabetes or another chronic condition that might fit into this type of category, what I have seen is when I share this knowledge. So I was at a JDRF, that's Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation conference, and I was talking about this, and all the people with diabetes in front of me were shaking their heads, right? Yes, of course, I get it. That makes so much sense. And one woman got up and said, "Oh my God, you've liberated me." Because what you mentioned is like, yes, we do hold ourselves responsible. But early days when I was interviewing people with diabetes, one young man said to me, basically, his impression of living with type 1 was, you're either a train wreck or a superhero. Meaning, if you're not taking care of it, you end up being a train wreck. And if you are taking care of it, you end up being a superhero because you have to be so diligent, right? So that's an easy slide into perfectionism and holding yourself guilty when your numbers don't show up the way you think they should, hoped. And even I experienced that because I'm human. Sometimes that first impulse when I look at my blood sugar and it's not what I want or expect is, darn. Although that may not be the word I use, but it's that feeling of, geez, how could this be? And I should have known better or done better or not taken that extra shot or not eaten that extra bite, whatever it is, right? It's so easy to blame yourself. In a way, I think in this instance, really knowledge is power. When you understand that you cannot control this beast, you can be as responsible as you can be, but basically you're responsible for your efforts and not your outcomes. To me, that's what liberates people. So who's ever listening now, if you happen to have diabetes or some such chronic illness, just understand that you can do your best and that's it. And most of the time it'll work out and sometimes it won't. And it's not your fault. It's not your fault. I think that's basically what liberates people. And, I actually, for the chapter we wrote in the Cynefin book, I interviewed a friend of mine who's a medical doctor who also happens to have type 1 diabetes. And when we were talking about doctors telling patients they can't control their diabetes, he said, while I perfectly agree with you, that would be a hard thing for doctors to do, right? And when I said, why? He said, well, one, patients do look up to us like we have all the answers, and it would be very hard for a lot of health professionals to step off that pedestal that patients put them on. And if we don't tell them we can control their blood sugar and their diabetes, then what are we going to tell them? We certainly can't say you can't control this. And so we talked about the fact that you can teach them how to influence, nudge, and navigate. And so there is this kind of built-in, and I really think this comes from medical school, where health professionals are taught that they have all the answers, even though we know the complexity in medicine is unbelievable. They can't possibly have all the answers. But they're kind of taught that they are the superior being, the authority. And And again, coming from that acute model that they have to fix this. And I don't believe this happens through any ill intent. I believe people who go into medicine want to help people. But as a favorite doctor and author of mine, Danielle Ofri, who's an internist at Bellevue here in New York, who writes books, has written, in the third year of medical school, empathy gets trained out of people who are becoming doctors. And then it's in the culture. So after you graduate, you're going to be learning from your superiors on the job. And there's this kind of attitude that's been trained into health professionals. And on the one hand, I understand it. If you got emotionally enmeshed with all your patients, how could you survive that? On the other hand, if you lose your humanity, can we really say that you're caring for your patients? So, yeah, the fact that we here in the States call it the industrialized healthcare industry. I mean, think about that. To equate healthcare with just being another industry or business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you've given me so many great quotes there.
Well, those were a lot of questions you had.
No, great quotes. And I've written them down because we're going to use them later on. But I've got a question. You've just posed such a good point, right? There is this need for healthcare that can be standardized, that can protect, practitioner burnout because they are consistently caring for people. There is a huge emotional component to this, both for the healthcare practitioner as well as for the patients. So, what are some pieces of advice? And because I asked 15 questions at once earlier, I'm going to ask these one at a time now. So first, what are some pieces of advice or things that have come from your experience or your conversations with practitioners, that you might be able to provide for people having to manage the need to balance between, yes, I want to be humane and connected to the patient need whilst protecting myself and whilst, of allowing myself to do this to multiple people and not just the one. How do we, try to strike that balance from the practitioner perspective?
It's funny. It's so interesting how the mind works, right? How you just get images in your head when you're asked certain things. The first thing that came into my head was when we were in India working at the clinic, the doctor who founded the clinic, he did something. We used to sit in on patient meetings he would have, right? Consultations. And he did something that we were very curious about. Before each patient, before they walked in his office, he put his hands together in a prayer-like position and bowed his head for like 10 seconds. And then the patient would walk in. And we finally asked him, Dr. Shrikanta, what are you doing? And he said, I'm wiping clean the last person I just saw, and I'm making a space for the next person who's going to walk in that door. What a beautiful practice. So he wasn't thinking about the last person any longer. He wasn't thinking about the pile up in the waiting room. He was bringing himself to be present for the next person. And I think because of industrialized healthcare, because health professionals no longer have largely as much time as they would like to spend with each person, they have another list in their head, right, of things that have to get done, and they're against the clock. the patients are piling up in their waiting room. There are boxes they have to tick for electronic records. They have to enter everything in the computer now. So there are so many adversarial forces occurring against their simply being present and an open space and to relate to the person in front of them. So I guess what occurs to me, and it's not that I'm an authority or that I know, but what makes sense to me right now in the moment, based on my experience, is for health professionals, as best you can, just try to be present for each person that's there with you, right? Because now is the only moment we have. And when you're with that patient in that moment, it's the only time you can influence them. And if they feel you're there present with them, you have so much more opportunity to work positively with them than if they feel your head and heart is somewhere else. And you could feel that. You feel that when you're with someone. You feel whether or not they're truly present with you, and it makes all the difference.
Yes, absolutely. That's again, it's such beautiful advice, but it also seems so common sense, and yet somehow it's so difficult. But I love the story you shared of this doctor who actually provides himself with this time between patients, his ritual that allows him to actually be present with the next person. And I think that that's such an actionable thing, right? It's just provide yourself, create these little affordances so that you can, have enough space for yourself, but also then prepare to be present for the next person. That's beautiful. Thank you for that one.
Yes.
So on to my next question then. I wanted to check from your perspective now, as a patient who's helped so many other people to flourish with chronic conditions, what are some pieces of advice you can provide for their emotional journeys, as they, particularly for those who are quite new to having to manage a condition? What are some things that they can do to help themselves?
Yeah. This is kind of what I've said for a very long time, and it's not really changed, although I have one thing at the end. First, learn everything you can. Learn everything about the condition. Learn how your body responds, right? We talk about learning about your patterns, what you eat, how they affect your blood sugar. I think when you know, it helps you feel more confident. Then I feel it's really important to meet other people who have diabetes. And it doesn't have to be a formal support group, or if there is such a thing in your area, go. It is an incredible emotional support to have other people in your life who have the same condition, because when I'm having a frustrating day and my husband says, I get it, the first thing I want to do is beat him up. He can't get it. If you don't live with it, you can't get it. But other people who live with it get it. And you need that. So for 10 years, I was a peer mentor. I would travel around the country talking to people who have diabetes. We were invited to give educational presentations, largely invited by diabetes educators who ran support groups. And I loved it. I loved it for so many reasons. One, I was helping other people. I was educating them. I was sharing my story. I was answering their questions. I was meeting diabetes educators. And this group of peer mentors, I believe we were 82 people at one point. And every year we got together to celebrate. And I made 3 of my best friends in that group who all have diabetes. And that was an incredible support. Now, of course, through my work, through being in the diabetes community, probably more of my friends have diabetes over the last 2 decades than don't. So I think it's really critical to have other friends who have diabetes. It will make a huge difference for you emotionally. And the third thing that comes to mind is a question I was asked at this last International Diabetes Federation conference we just had in December in Lisbon, where I was on a panel and we were asked if you could write a letter to yourself when you got diabetes, what would you tell yourself? And one of my fellow panelists said, learn everything you can, basically. And what came to my mind is, I'm not going to tell myself at 18, don't worry, you'll be okay. Because you don't really know if that will be true. You can't predict that. But what I would tell my 18-year-old self is, learn to accept that you have this condition and it's just a part of you. Belle once wrote in an article, well, for me, Riva's diabetes is just like her curly hair or her green eyes. It's just a part of her. It is just a part of me. It's not something to hold outside of myself. It's not something to deny. It's not something to fight against. It's just a part of myself, and I will learn to live with it. I will learn to be friends with it. And I think that's useful advice.
Mm-hmm. That is beautiful advice. I think, it transcends just having diabetes. It's a lot of things, isn't it? If we could just learn to make peace with ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah. And so links to this salutogenic approach that underpins the flourishing approach to diabetes you've developed. There is this aspect, there are 3 aspects, right? Making sense of the condition, understanding it, how do you actually respond to it? So there is the manageability, the comprehensibility, and then for me, the most valuable part of this is actually the meaning-making component. What are some things from your experience or from your conversations with others that really helps you to find meaning in having this?
Before I go there, I want to just clarify. So this idea of understanding the condition and how to work with it and meaningfulness is not mine. It's actually medical sociologist Aaron Antonovsky who came up with this sense of coherence. And those were the 3 points in his sense of coherence, which partially underlies the flourishing approach. As for meaning making, it's really, that really comes up in the open dialogue between provider and patient. It's really an inquiry into what's important to you. Of course, most people will generally say my family. So help the patient understand how taking care of their diabetes could help them have more and better quality time with their family. Well, I remember once reading a story from a fairly well-known diabetologist here, Ann Peters, and she said she had worked with a patient and was not so successful until she really came to learn from him that what was important to him was fishing. And so she helped him understand how if he took better management of his blood sugar and his diabetes, he'd have more opportunity to go fishing. There would be just more days to fish. He wouldn't have to miss days because he didn't feel well because his blood sugar was too high or too low. So that because it's kind of amorphous, vague, like, yes, take care of your diabetes, take care of your blood sugar. But what the heck does that really mean? And why should I bother? And this is hard. And well, so make it concrete. what benefit would there be to you to be well, to be better, to not, to not have those bad days because your diabetes is giving you problems. So, yeah, I mean, for me personally, I guess my meaningfulness is just to, it's not fly fishing because I live in Brooklyn. But it's really that each day I can feel as well as I can feel so that I can be productive and travel with my husband, which I love to do. Travel is one of my great loves, and continue to do this work, which I love, and interact with my friends. And, so, yeah, so that's why it's important to me. And, it's, yeah, for a lot of people, especially people who have type 2, who tend to be older, they will say their grandkids, to be around for their grandkids, to play with them, that kind of thing, which is, of course, common sense.
Yes. Oh, that's really great. You've lived in Japan, you've traveled quite a bit, as you've mentioned. You love travel, and you also go all over the world to do the work that you do. So I wanted to understand from your experience how different cultures might respond to chronic conditions, how some types of cultures might be better disposed to supporting people with chronic conditions. Are there any stories or examples you could share?
Yeah, so, on the one hand, humanity is humanity. We are all alike. On the other hand, it is true, culture is very defining in key ways. So in Japan, I think what's really different is, as Badwain says, they are a we culture, right? That's very true in Asia, I think. And of course, I experienced it in Japan. We do things for the we, for the whole, that we are all in this together. Whereas in America and a lot of Western cultures, it's a me culture, a very individualistic culture. So, so here in the States, it's all about pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You alone are responsible for this. Whereas, Badwain is Dutch Indonesian, and he grew up in Holland, but his home life was Indonesian because his parents both grew up in Indonesia. And he said, in my home, it was all about we were there for each other. And that was the whole culture of his background, Dutch Indonesian. So it was a very odd dichotomy that in his home, it was we. And when he stepped out the door and he was in Dutch culture, it was me. It's really interesting. So, like here in the States, and I'm experiencing it right now, my mother has been in the hospital because she took a fall. We always say, if you're in the hospital, you need an advocate. You need someone who's going to look out for you. Well, I just don't even know if that idea would exist in Japan, that you need an advocate, because the culture is about looking after each other, that we're in this together. So, so I think in that way, in healthcare, you can see the cultural difference. Now, this is interesting. So the same doctor that I told you about in India, who does this little ritual of making space to be present, in his diabetes clinic for the poor, he was serving coffee and tea, both to staff and to patients. And guess what? Because in India, sweets are so prevalent, the coffee and tea had sugar in it. So he's serving coffee and tea with sugar in it to people who have diabetes. So I said, Dr. Shrikanta, this has to end. And he fought me until I left. And then he said, okay, Riva, I'm going to stop doing it. And so I checked in with him a couple months later. And indeed, at least he said to me, nope, I've stopped doing it. We don't serve coffee and tea with sugar anymore. But that's a cultural thing where sweets, like when you go to the temples there are always sweets. When you get together with other people, there are always sweets. It is just part of the culture. Well, it's difficult to live in such a place when you have diabetes and you have to go against that grain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so funny. I mean, I think it's also the cultural expectations of the exchange, right? Like I've come for this and I want to give you a token that makes you feel a bit better. So therefore there is this sweet treat at the end of it.
Yes, we went to a temple, I think, as soon as we got there, and we were given by the priest, whatever he'd be called in India, sweets as a gesture of welcome. And then I think, oh, geez, what do I do? I mean, I don't typically eat sweets and it's going to raise my blood sugar. So I most likely took a small bite and then gave the rest about.
You've mentioned Bao multiple times in this interview, and I know your husband, and he's a lovely man. It's clear to me that it's really important to have a supportive partner, a supportive family, so you're not alone in managing this.
Yeah, I think it's, of course, if you're lucky enough, it's amazing. So, because the first 16 years of our marriage, he was commuting to Holland, and he still wanted to be supportive, although he wasn't physically here, we came up with the idea that every morning we would email each other. And basically, all I would write in the subject line is, I'm up. Because he wanted the reassurance of knowing, I wasn't lying on the kitchen floor passed out from having a low. And so little things like that. And I have friends. So, on my continuous glucose monitor, I have the option of sharing my numbers with somebody. So he can see my blood sugar on his Apple Watch. And that's an option. You don't have to do that. And I have found lots of people who have diabetes will do that with their partners, even sometimes with friends. And there are other people who just feel, no, it's private. And, I tend to think there's also maybe this fear of shame and guilt if my numbers aren't quote unquote good. I don't want anybody else to know. And so they choose not to do that. But I find the support of a partner invaluable. If I'm going low and it alarms on his watch at a certain level, he will text me, call me, are you okay? So that's, and I told this story when I was at the IDF conference in December, that I had a boyfriend in years past who was living in London, and I had flown over to see him. And the first night I woke up in the middle of the night around 3 a.m. with a low blood sugar that I needed to get sugar for, or I was going to be in serious trouble. And he felt me in the bed wake up, and he kind of mumbled, what's happening? And I said, I'm really low. I have to get sugar. And then he just went back to bed. And so I'm in this flat. I was in London. It's called Flat. I didn't know. I wasn't familiar with. So I didn't turn on a light because I didn't want to wake him up. So I groped my way to the kitchen, and I'm feeling on all the countertops to find something that's got sugar in it. And finally, I found a tin of shortbread cookies, and I sat on the floor because at this point my blood sugar was low enough that I didn't have the energy to stand. And I just sat there for 20 minutes and ate a bunch of cookies and waited for that feeling when you know your blood sugar is coming back up into normal range. And then I got quietly, gingerly, so I wouldn't wake him up, back into bed. But there was an alarm going on in my head, which was, leave him, leave him, leave him. And, the idea that I and my diabetes wouldn't be respected enough, that somebody wouldn't care enough to help me. So I told this story, and while I was telling it, then there were a bunch of young women in the audience. You could hear a pin drop, like they were so focused. And I said, if you're with someone, God bless you, I hope. He's like my current husband. And if you're not, please, you look for somebody who's going to treat you with respect. You deserve that. So, I think that's really critical.
Wow. No, that's, again, Riva, a beautiful story, beautiful sharing, and so applicable for all women, really, and particularly for people who need their conditions respected as well. So, yeah, that's wonderful. So I'm going to ask you the question that we like to ask our guests at the end of the podcast, which is, if you could point people's attention to something important in the world, something that you're passionate about, something that you feel would make a huge difference, what would that thing be?
I've kind of been on this spiritual journey my whole life, and more intensely the last few years. And in the study of spirituality, the idea is that the place to concentrate on is becoming more present. And so there are so many ills in our society today, and we have this sense of either overwhelm, like, what can I do? I'm only one person. Is this ever going to get better? Well, of course, I applaud anyone who feels drawn to do something particularly to help the world, whether it's about climate change or poverty or hunger or anything, abuse. At the same time, I think what will also and more profoundly help the world is each of us becoming more conscious. As we each become more conscious of being a loving, kind presence in the world, then the world will become a better place, right? Because the ills that we look at were created by man. And we can go out there and try to fix them, but in many ways that's a Band-Aid, because something else will break. But if we look to become more loving, kind, conscious, present with each other, then we begin to elevate consciousness in the world. And in that way, the influence we have on the world becomes one of love and kindness. We will see the planet and nature as ourselves. We will no longer want to damage it for greedy short-term goals. So that's my answer.
That's a beautiful answer. And I was listening to this other podcast that was talking about the Dalai Lama's main message, and that's actually his main message.
Really? You stole it from me. Thank you for telling me.
How do we become more loving? How do we begin from a place of love, right? And it's such a difficult task somehow, but that's a beautiful message.
Yeah, maybe. Well, it may be difficult, or it may not be as difficult as we think, but it's certainly a worthy task.
Oh, Riva, you have just been the most incredible person to speak to. You've made this interview so easy for me. Thank you so much for carrying the conversation.
My pleasure. It's about, I didn't have to go anywhere. I could just sit here in my living room and have the pure delight of chatting with you.
So, what we like to do on the Salience podcast is wrap up with a summary of the three points of salience that I took for the conversation, and I'm going to use your words back in the summary. So the first one I really love, a quote around the flourishing approach is rapport before report. How do we actually establish a connection? How do we understand what will work for people rather than to, assume that there's some kind of a standard that will apply to everybody? How do you be present with people? And that's such a critical component of rapport and actually clearing that headspace and that space of attention for the next person while preserving yourself as well. So that was the first point. Second point, another quote from you. So make sure that you respect yourself for the effort and not the outcomes. So often we live in an outcome-driven culture, and I think that that's so damaging because so often you cannot control the outcomes. You can only control and actually manage what you can put into it. So it's the effort. And how do you actually learn to accept yourself? As you've mentioned, your diabetes is a part of you. How do you learn to accept yourself? And that message, that piece of advice goes beyond just those with chronic condition. Is really, how do you come to be at peace with yourself? How do you make decisions that truly prioritize respect for you, as you did when you decided, I have to leave this man. He doesn't respect me. He doesn't respect my needs. Right. And the third one, I think, is the central message that I've taken away from your approach, this more salutogenic approach, is not control. We can only influence. Right. It's how do we learn? How do we cultivate as much knowledge as we can about something? How do we connect with others who can actually make things come alive and help us to understand our own conditions? Those for me, and those are your words, Riva. The quotes that I was writing down earlier are the 3 points of salience that I took away. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's perfectly perceptive. I would agree with your assessment.
This has just been the greatest conversation. Thank you so much, Riva.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you, Shen.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.